So welcome everybody to our last governance and management research speaker series of the semester. I want to thank you for taking the time to attend. I know that the Zoom fatigue is affecting everybody and we're ready for the semester basically to get over with. But we have a wonderful speaker here today, Dr. Andrea Headley from the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. Is going to be talking to us about her criminal justice research. I didn't know this until I talked to Claudia the other day. I didn't realize that Andrea, you had been here presenting just a couple years or so ago. So welcome back. It is you have been just from my scanning of your CV very productive over the last few years, and so you've been doing some really exciting research. We're really happy to have you here. So for those of you who are not familiar with Professor Headley, she has been at Georgetown now for just this year. Prior to that, she was at Ohio State for a year, and prior to that, I believe was a postdoc at Berkeley. She is also holds an appointment as a visiting scholar of race, policing, and crime at the National Police Foundation, and her research focuses on public management, racial equity, social justice, and criminal justice policy. And so at this point, I will just say thank you again for taking the time to speak with us so late in the semester, and I'll hand it over to you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you. I will go ahead and share my screen. It is nice to be back with you all. And so everyone, hopefully, you see yeah? Okay, great. And so, so I was here a couple of years ago. I presented with a colleague on a paper looking at race and use of force, racial congruence and use of force interactions. And we looked at whether or not racial salience or identity salience, if you will, in use of force interactions, individual level interactions, impact outcomes of severity for use of force. And so it took us a while to actually get that study published. I feel like 2 or 3 years since we presented it a couple years ago, but that is out. And so today I'm going to be kind of focusing on the theme of this research, but taking a qualitative approach to it to try to unpack what exactly we're actually potentially seeing when we see these interactions between officers of color and the public, as well as white officers in the public. And so I'll be presenting on that. I think obviously the research in policing has been timely for a couple of years, but I would be remiss to not acknowledge the recent events that have happened, right, with the conviction of Officer Chauvin, as well as additional kind of shootings or killings that have taken place over the past couple of days or so. And so I think that this is obviously still an important research topic. Granted, I'm biased because I do it, but I think that it's still an important topic that's worthy of investigation. And so thank you all for allowing me to be here. The research I'm presenting on today was funded by the Department of Justice, so I just want to acknowledge that. Obviously, they're not responsible for it. But calls for increased diversity in policing are really a historical feature of police reform efforts. And so historically, police departments are typically monolithic. They're comprised of mainly white males. And we've seen and heard calls for more diversity for really 2 primary reasons. One, from more of like an equal opportunity perspective or an HR perspective, thinking about gaining access to gainful employment. And then the other, really thinking about the potential behavioral or perceptual implications for communities of color in particular. And so really, it's, I think, a large part of the reason why people have asked for more representation in policing is really because people think it would hopefully lead to this, right? These images in terms of thinking about maybe shared understanding, more relatability, for instance, right? Which is, and hopefully that translating into a prevention of maybe biased policing patterns, preventing perceived or actual discrimination, reducing use of force, and things like that, right? Ideally, it's to improve trust and legitimacy. That said, it's not just a policing issue, right? These same types of conversations are happening in education when we think about trying to get more teachers of color. They're happening in medicine when we think about the importance of Black doctors or Latinx doctors, and I'm sure in other contexts as well. And so the question of diversity, the question of representation is a much broader issue. I always like to kind of put policing in context. While sometimes I feel like I don't necessarily have to, I think it's important to think about policing as really the front line in government, right? So thinking about street level bureaucrats in particular, police officers represent the state, if you will, and they have lots of interactions with civilians, right? One of the only, if only, public sector agency that has 24/7 kind of interaction with the public. And it's estimated approximately every year they kind of have about 50 million interactions, right? They operate within bureaucratic structures, the structures that we all learn about in PA and management, right? Thinking about hierarchy, division of labor, right? All of those essential characteristics that make up a bureaucracy. They also operate within highly politicized environments and often are subject to kind of political will, and they functions based on policy with considerable amounts of discretion. I think another reason or another importance, I think, of thinking about policing in context is that policing and criminal justice intersects with so many other policy areas as well, from health, housing, education, economics, political participation, and so forth. And then the negative impacts of extend from material ones, thinking about potential loss of property, money, being arrested, having your liberties imposed, but also negative psychological impacts on mental health and well-being, for instance, and then social impacts that really shape individuals' patterns of behaviors. And so there's lots of reasons why I think studying this context is particularly important and has implications going forward. And so I'm sure you all are well aware of RB theory, but obviously one of the theories that we use in public management to really think about diversity is the theory of representative bureaucracy, right? Which generally just argues that a workforce should be representative of the people they serve in terms of lots of different characteristics. And so if there is a community that's diverse, right, the workforce should represent or reflect that community as well. And in the general literature, I think there's kind of 4 trends that I kind of will talk about a little bit here. And work really focused on the notion of just passive or descriptive representation, just assessing whether or not the bureaucracy is demographically represented at all of the public, and then looking at what factors correlate or predict the likelihood of an organization being more or less representative. Subsequent work really focused on distinguishing between passive and active representation, right? So thinking about whether bureaucrats who hold similar characteristics as the people that they serve also have some value to them acting in ways that advance the interests of those groups. And so really trying to see if they use their discretion and wheels in ways to impact outcomes for groups that may be underserved or underrepresented. And then later work really began focusing more on the notion of symbolic representation, right? So which this really gets at this idea that regardless or not a representative bureaucrat is actively engaging in behavior that benefits a specific group, the mere passive characteristics of them cognitively impact citizens in terms of their perceptions, whether they feel the bureaucracy is legitimate or the bureaucrat is legitimate, for instance. And so really the perceptual or psychological impacts that seeing a bureaucracy has for people who share those demographics. And so there's evidence in different contexts about the effectiveness of RB. And so thinking about what we know broadly speaking, there is kind of positive benefits that we found across a wide variety of contexts. So in education, we do see that students of color have more positive and beneficial outcomes from same race teachers. Particularly when looking at things like gifted and honors class or decreased absenteeism and suspensions. We also know that teachers of color often hold higher expectations for students of color with regard to their educational attainment. In the healthcare context, there's some evidence that suggests that when doctors and patients are of the same race, there's greater patient satisfaction and greater utilization of healthcare services for patients. In policing in particular, though, when we narrow down and kind of think about this work a little bit more, I think the research is a bit more mixed. So on one end, we do know that civilian perceptions are improved with representative police forces, but with more behavioral measures, the studies are a bit mixed. So some racial representation research suggests that there's associations with racial representation and negative police outcomes. And so we see decreased crime, decreased ticketing, decreased complaints or arrests. And then there's other research that shows that there are actually negative impacts with having officers of color on the police force, including increased coercive racial profiling and still police shootings. And so one of the things that I try to add to this literature with citation and in paper in particular is that most of the art is quantitative, right? And it's for good reason, I think. And usually, though, they impose identity salience, right? And so we have people who have filled out demographic, HR data saying that I am Black or I'm white, yes or no, whatever the case may be, or someone who has filled out it on behalf of the citizen that they are engaging with. But we don't really ever get at what that identity means to that person, right? So how salient is this identity to someone and how that plays out. And so I'm hoping through my qualitative study, I can really unpack and understand the relevance and impact of both professional identity, so thinking about someone's work identity as a police officer, and then their non-work personal identity, so thinking about race in particular, and how that impacts how they perceive themselves as well as how they do their job. And so to address this, as I alluded to in the beginning, I am using qualitative research methods. And so this is from an in-depth case study I did. And it's really just one part of a larger qualitative study I did that I'll be presenting on. And so in order to identify the appropriate case study site, when I was originally doing this work, I kind of used 3 levels of criteria that I will talk through before talking about the specific site itself. And so first, I created a police citizen conflict index that was to try to identify police with the police citizen conflict. And I created this using this geometric aggregation method of police shootings, police use of force, civilian complaints, and assaults against officers. And so you'll notice the geographical representation comparing police citizen conflict and overlaying that with minority populations across about 278 cities in the US. And so these were the cities that had most of the data. But when I was originally trying to pick a case study site, I find a place that definitely had some tensions with police community relations. And so I used those measures as indicators. After I created this index, I then ranked police citizen conflict scores, and I tried to limit the sample to only cities that had a large minority population, which I ended up, my cutoff point was 30% or more of the population I had to identify as Black or Latinx. And I want to focus on a relatively large city, give or take, to try to have some diversity with regards to neighborhoods as well. And then after identifying those top 5 cities, I examined historical and current events pertaining to the police community relations in the top 5 cities, and then narrowed in to pick a suitable location. So the place that I ended up picking was Hartford, Connecticut. And historically, Hartford, these pictures are from Hartford, Connecticut, thinking obviously way back when, but historically, the Hartford Police Department has had contentious relationships with the community. After the race riots of the 1960s, one crucial and defining moment in Hartford's police community relations occurred as part of this court case called Cintron versus Bond, filed in 1969. And this lawsuit was filed against the police department that essentially argued that there was discriminatory behavior towards Hartford's communities of color. This case resulted in a consent decree that was settled in the 1970s, and it mandated that there was numerous organizational changes that had to occur, one of which was increased diversity on the police force. And so the decree was in effect, but it was not enforced up until the 2000s. And so from the 1970s to the 2000s, and then the court case was revisited when a white officer fatally shot a young Black boy. And that led to an appointment of an independent monitor to try to enforce with the decree. And the decree was supposed to expire in 2016. And it then got extended for a couple of more years because the judge at the time felt that they still did not have the level of diversity in their police department to match the level of diversity in the community. And so I thought this was a really important historical context and case to try to understand to what extent diversity and representation really matters for the community specifically. And so Hartford, Connecticut, specifically is a city with about a little bit over 120,000 population, right? They are predominantly a city of minority, so 44% Latinx, 35% Black. And to me, I thought this was really important to be able to understand that diversity. They have a pretty high poverty rate, as you see on the screen, right? Almost 32% of the population is living below the poverty line. And so while I think sometimes people think when I tell about Hartford, like, oh, wow, like Hartford, it's not like one of the major cities or what have you. It's in a a state that has a very high per capita income, generally speaking, right? It's also the capital of Connecticut. But when we think about the statistics, they resemble inner cities, similar inner cities around the country. They have a violent crime rate that is approximately almost 3 times the national average, a property crime rate that's about 2 times the national average. And in 2016, when I was I went there in 2017, but when I was originally looking to go there, they had about 120 shootings, right, in 1 year. And the police department itself has about 400 officers, which is a relatively large amount of officers for a small city. But given the statistics with regards to crime, makes sense in terms of why there's so many officers. And generally speaking, the demographic composition of the police department is largely white, but they still have a good share of Latinx and Black officers, particularly when comparing to police departments across the country. And so in 2017, I spent the summer months in Hartford trying to understand their police community relations. And before I get into the specific methods, and while policing is often a contentious topic, I think it's important to also show different sides of this. And so here are a picture that I took during my time in Hartford that I got to be able to use. But the first picture was during a ride along I did with a community service officer who was called to figure out why a lady was sitting under a tree. And so she was crying. She didn't speak English. The primary officer called another officer to assist in language translation. And we received notice that she had to be out of her apartment and she had to go. And she didn't know, though, that she still had a month or so left. And so the officers then tried to explain this to her, and then they helped her move back into the apartment. The second picture is when I was walking with officers doing a walk beat. Another officer drove by, saw us interacting with the kids, and decided to stop and let the kids play in his car. And then the third image is of the community service officer with the Police Athletic League, who was, they were doing a shoe drive for kids. And so this was during the shoe drive. And so in 2017, I did about 70 hours of participant observation. So that was ride-alongs, attending internal meetings, attending community events, et cetera. I conducted about 88 semi-structured interviews, which is really what I will focus on for today's presentation. And then I reviewed about 100 secondary documents, some of which were given to me from the police department, some from nonprofit organizations, others from public officials, and so forth. And those documents really spanned probably from 2010 to 2017. And so I'll spend some time a bit more just about the interviews, since that is where I'll focus today. And so in general, I broke up the interviewees into kind of 2 broad groups: police representatives, and that included both frontline officers as well as police managers or leaders, and then community leaders, which included nonprofit leaders, government officials, public officials, et cetera. I used a combination of sampling strategies to identify my target populations. For the police department, I started with the leadership and then asked for recommendations of others. And so a combination of snowball sampling, really. And I spent a lot of time at the police department, though people eventually started just volunteering to talk to me as well, especially after I baked cookies for them. And so thinking about field work, it's important to bond, I think, and connect with the people trying to understand and learn and work with. And then for the community leaders, I identified an initial list of news articles and reports that referenced key leaders who were talking about policing in the community. And I wanted to really focus on leaders who had a good working knowledge of the internal dynamics of the organization. And so I didn't just focus on like just the public broadly or everyday citizens who have interactions with policing. I focused specifically on leaders because the larger study was trying to understand the organizational factors in police to make a difference. And so for today's presentation, I'm going to focus specifically on 32 frontline police interviews from that, especially because I wanted to make sure I had a good understanding of how officers perceived their identity and how that impacted what they do in the streets, if at all. And so that is what I will focus on for today. The sample characteristics. And so for the officers that I interviewed, the frontline officers, I would say that there was a pretty good racial breakdown in terms of what the distribution of officers who identified as white, Black, or Latinx. As we see, there's about a third in each category, give or take. Overall, there was definitely more officers who identified as a male as opposed to a female. And you see the age distribution as well, that about 40% were between 18 to 35, and another 40% were between 36 to 45 years old. With regards to education, almost half the sample had an associate's degree or higher. Over half of the sample were either from the city of Hartford or lived in the city at some point. And over 60% of the sample had about 9 or more years in the agency. So they've been around for a little bit, a long time, if you will. And then finally, while all officers were frontline, about half of the sample were traditional police officers, not responding to 911 calls, and another half of the sample represented a specialized unit. So that may be a community service officer, a faith-based officer, a detective, or so forth. And so with regards to the interviewing process and questions asked, again, today's study is taken from a larger study. And so the larger study was designed, the purpose was described to participants to understand the organizational factors that impact police community relations, broadly speaking. Obviously, consent was granted by all of them. They were ensured confidentiality. So the names that I use here are pseudonyms. And then the majority of interviews occurred while frontline police officers were on duty, usually in person. And this could have been at the police department or in officers' patrol cars, for instance. But there was a few cases that it took place outside of work hours. So we would do it at a coffee shop or over lunch or what have you. I used a semi-structured interviewing guide to really allow for some flexibility, but still guide the interview, broadly speaking. And so there was questions about demographics, community policing, training, finances, et cetera. But the two primary questions that I'm focusing on for today is, how do officers coming from Hartford or living in the community impact police community relations? And what impact has increased raciality had on police community relations? And so I talk about these, or I will talk about these, as both identity as opposed to professional identity. And so residential identity on one end and then racial identity on the other. About 26 of the audio recorded and transcribed, but there was 6 interviews where they did not want to be recorded. And so I took handwritten notes. I used in vivo to doing kind of data storage and organization and coding. And then I used 2 primary methods to analyze the data. And so content analysis to really identify themes and patterns, as well as explanation building. So trying to make sense of the larger. I'm going to walk through my coding process. And so generally speaking, I read each transcription in its entirety, and I coded the types of identities that were present throughout the interview. And this could be identities that were stated explicitly or implicitly. And the 3 primary identities that emerged were race, ethnicity, origin or residency, and then occupation or profession. And so those are the 3 that I am going to focus on. And then once those were transcribed just by saying what these identities were, I then went and reread associated with them to try and then make meaning out of what they were saying about how these identities meant or manifested for them. And so I did subsequent in vivo coding using the words directly from the interviews. And then I put them into relevant clusters, grouping, I categorized them to try and assess for patterns and links. I'm not going to spend time talking about each one of these in depth, just for the purposes of time, but I do want to say that although this research is not without limitations, I did use specific methods to make sure that the data collection and the content analysis kind of adhering to overall qualities in the overall quality of the research with regards to qualitative rigor in particular. And so I made sure throughout, and I'm happy to talk in Q&A to talk more about the specific things that I did for each of these, but I did make sure with regards to how credible the information was, whether or not it's transferable in terms of thinking about not necessarily generalizability, but how this speaks to larger themes, for instance, or potential similar cases that maybe have very similar characteristics, and then questions of confirmability as well. And so there's different for all of these. And so let me get to the findings. And so now, I think the way I will talk about the findings is really around these larger themes, and I will present quotes from them. And so we'll go through them more in depth. But first, I'll just kind of present a broader overview. But frontline police officers have identities that vary in type and magnitude, right? And discussing the relevance of their personal non-work identity types, 2 primary identities were focused on. And so that's, again, the racial identity and the residential identity, whereas the professional work identity was that of being a police officer. And so starting with the professional identity, officers often talked about the negative ways in which the community perceived them because of the visible career choice. Officers often shared the strengths and positive features that sharing personal identity comes with, particularly increased understanding and relatability. However, they also talked about the ways in which shared identity may entail competing expectations and pressures as officers seek to maintain fair treatment and not be perceived as biased. And so this really is a dichotomy of using shared personal identity traits to get closer to the public and build relationships, but then having a competing pressure from their professional identity to maintain arm's length and fair treatment. And then lastly, officers re-emphasized that proper treatment and behavior are most important and above and beyond any identity, personal or professional. And so again, I'll go through each of these a little bit more. And so the officer identity, a recurring theme throughout the interviews with officers centered around occupational or professional identity. And so thinking about the police officer as an identity itself, more often than not, officers shared how the public often perceived them as one. Here, officers' community stereotypes of them that were negative, and that this could transcend racial and residential similarity. So it didn't matter if I was of the same race or I was from this neighborhood, right? If I'm an officer, I'm perceived a certain way. Relatedly, officers often talked about this direct and visible effect of wearing a uniform and what that meant and how it may trigger negative perceptions. Officers shared that what happens in one place with policing impacts everywhere all across the country, which is often exacerbated by the media and the proliferation of negative stories. And there was a desire from some officers to be seen as normal, as human, not painted with the same broad brush. However, over time, they talked about how they may build up a wall and get used to stereotypes. And then some officers de-emphasized socio-demographic identity by reaffirming the officer identity, and that all officers are trained the same, they treat people the same, and they provide the same services. And so about 75% of the sample talked about this, what I'm calling kind of is this officer identity. And so a quote to kind of emphasize this, the first quote reads, "When the community first sees you, they don't see you. They see this uniform, they see the badge, they see the marked car. There's a tradition and a pride that comes with the uniform. For a lot of cops in general, it becomes your identity." And so this quote highlights that the police role, again, identity in and of itself. And to me, it highlights the culture of policing that comes with the tradition and pride that's perpetuated in an organization. The second quote for this theme reads, "Even as a Black officer, I know the community can't stand the police. And I tell people, you don't even know me. The only thing you see is the uniform or badge. But some of the things they say, some of the ways they look at you, it's there." Again, so this officer highlights his race as a Black officer, saying, even though I'm Black, it doesn't matter, right? But they only see this me as a police officer. The second theme was on increased relatability and understanding, particularly around this personal identity. And so thinking about race and residential identity, I talk about them, the themes I talk about them together, just because in Hartford in particular, because it was a predominantly minority community, when people often said that they wanted to hire a Hartford resident, what they were saying was they wanted to hire someone of color, and they used them interchangeably. And so I didn't want to artificially like parse them out here when it was a bit hard to do. But when I do acknowledge differences that people clearly state, I acknowledge those differences. So again, this quote is thinking about race and residential identity kind of similarly, although they're not the same. So here, interviewees discussed that these characteristics allow for relatability and identification, right? Interviewees here talked about visibly looking like the community being served, and being from or having lived in the community itself is a way to have shared similar ways of living. And they talked about when there's a shared demographic identity, this can help facilitate shared understanding, a shared knowledge, or a shared experience. And they talked about the way in which that sharing can lead to tangible benefits, including building relationships in the community, fostering community trust and rapport, getting pertinent information or cooperation from the community. Police officers often also discussed how community members may be more comfortable with speaking with them when they look like them or when they know that they're from the community, for instance, and that they may actually have an explicit preference for engaging with such officers. Along these same lines, they discussed the importance of shared language, as again, the majority of the population, almost half of the population in Hartford, identified as Latinx. And so shared language was really important. And so they talked about how that also facilitates comfort and preference in the community. And being able to communicate in other language was really seen as important. And then lastly, a subset of officers spoke about the importance of shared race and residency as a signal to the community that officers can be role models and inspire hope. And so about 87.5% of the sample really hit on this topic. A quote in this theme reads, "Growing up, I used to sit on my front porch. So when I see people doing it, it's not a problem with me. Being from here helps you have a perspective on why people do the things they do or why things are happening the way they happen." And so in particular, right, this quote was taken from an officer talking about the way in which some officers view that behavior as potentially problematic or causing trouble if people are outside the house, lingering around, et cetera. And this officer was saying, like, it's just something that we did, right? I get that. And so I don't view it in the same way. The second quote here reads, "They tend to trust you more. They lean towards you more because you could relate to them. So if I'm working with a guy that's Black and we have to execute a search warrant in a primarily Black neighborhood, I'm going to let him do the talking because he could relate more." And so this actually was an officer, a Latinx officer who was speaking here. And to me, this also showed that even between officers of color, there was an understanding that the shared identity of the community makes a difference when you're engaging. And sometimes it may be better to have an officer who can relate, speak to certain populations, lead to a better interaction overall. And so this is not the last theme, but the third theme here is about the consequences of dissimilarity and similarity. To me, this is probably one of the most interesting parts of the research here, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around trying to understand it further. And so this theme really talked about the idea that when there is similar racial identities or matches, that there's expectations and pressures, and when there's a racial mismatch or dissimilarity, that it also has its consequences. And so first, thinking about dissimilarity, police officers often emphasize that while race and residency can lead to benefits, there's some drawbacks, right, to focusing entirely on the demographic characteristics. Here, officers discuss that there may be an immediate barrier or threat perceived from an officer as compared to an officer of color, even if there's no that exists in that moment. A smaller subset of officers suggested that even when racial demographics could be irrelevant to an incident, some community members engage in a form of racial reasoning that attributes the encounter itself or the treatment during the encounter to race. And then officers here also talked about just having a culture shock or a learning curve coming to this community, coming to this city in particular, because they didn't understand or they didn't have the knowledge of certain cultures that could have been beneficial in helping them to police a certain way. And so when we think about similarity, though, this was particularly present for officers of color. So they talked about the ways in which shared demographics still has its consequences when I'm engaging with a community of color. And so two things here discussed were residential risk, racial downplaying. So for residential risks, officers here, these were officers who were from the community, who lived in Hartford, grew up in Hartford, and they often referred to potential problems that occur when officers police communities that they're from or that they currently live in still. Here, officers discussed having to arrest people that they may know. They emphasized a lack of work-life separation and the potential of personal victimization and reduced perceptions. With regards to playing, here, officers of color in particular de-emphasized or de-legitimized the importance of their own race or the race of their peers in serving the community. For instance, some officers of color hinted at wanting to be treated the same regardless of their race, and others discussed community expectations of handouts when there was a shared identity. Together, to me, sentiments of residential risk as well as racial downplaying. And then the last one, preference avoidance. Again, officers here kind of expressed a sentiment of like they didn't want to be perceived by others as being biased in favor of the racial demographic that they share in the community, right? And so they really voiced this kind of issue that they were concerned about. But all of these together kind of get at this maybe burden, if you will, or additional responsibilities that people from the community who share the same race or share same residential identity may have to kind of deal with when navigating their professional identity. And so a quote here reads, "I know I'm a white guy working in a minority region of the city. I didn't grow up in the city. I don't have friends in the city. I've never lived in the city." And coming in with that background, despite trying to be a professional employee, it really puts you at a disadvantage, and that people to essentially help every day and deal with don't give you the same respect as somebody else. And so this was getting at the first part of the theme that I talked about, this dissimilarity. So what it means when you don't share the same race and how people express that. And then this quote gets at this consequences of similarity in particular. And so this quote reads, "When I'm in uniform, I'm an officer. I do not want people to see my color. I want them to respect the uniform. Do not look at the Black cop, just look at the person who is doing their job that happens to be Black. And so to me, this gets at the importance that race could potentially play, and the importance of just wanting to be seen with regards to their professional identity in particular. Okay, last theme here is thinking about beyond identity and thinking about the importance of treatment and behavior. And so overall, police officers here, the largest amount of police officers actually talked about, while demographic similarities, personal identity may be important, they don't suffice to create a good quality police officer, and that above and beyond the police badge, that the treatment and behavior are most important. And so specifically, officers said that what mattered most was their treatment in the community, treatment toward the community, including but not limited to their interpersonal interactions, how they communicated, their attitudes and their behavior. Officers really emphasize the importance of community breaking barriers, for developing and understanding, demonstrating relatability, for showing respect, for building rapport. And while some officers did emphasize that those who are from the community may have a certain level of care or a certain level of loyalty, other officers suggested that caring about the community is not dependent on where you're from or how you look. Officers also shared that there were times where people who shared the same race or ethnicity who were from they could still be harsher potentially when interacting with the community. And so that point really underscores the importance, or the importance that they were making, of kind of irrespective of identity, an officer's behavior is most consequential. Officers also emphasize that no matter who you are or where you're from, like, you still need to learn and you need to understand, you need to integrate with the community. And even when traits that are similar, over time, they could overlap by learning and understanding. And so a quote here reads, "A Black male with a white t-shirt, the sight of it just curled my skin. It just boiled my blood. Because the certain area that I worked in, they were the ones committing the shootings, the drugs, develop prejudices and biases, and you can do it with your own people. I am Black and I feel this way. I can imagine how these white officers feel." And so this, again, is a Black officer talking about his own visceral reaction to seeing someone who shared his same identity because of the way in which he associated it by the nature of his job with crime and drugs and what have you, right? Again, reaffirming the idea that it's not only identity, right? It's also about just the interactions that are happening in the actual neighborhoods. And then here, another officer says, "At the end of the day, you just want good officers, regardless of where they're from. It's about you caring and your work ethic, how you speak to people and what your goals are in the police department. Because eventually you'll know the streets and the culture, and you will eventually learn enough to know the community and understand. That comes with time." Again, emphasizing the kind of importance of learning over time and how officers can all develop that regardless of sharing similar personal identities. And so the purpose of this research was to understand, again, how personal and professional identities may impact frontline workers, in this case, policing, and thinking about how they carry out their jobs. But also it was trying to make sense of some of the mixed research of, like, why sometimes officers of color, make a difference when we look at quantitative studies, and why other times they don't make a difference. And so I'll talk a little bit about all of that. But the interviews to me highlight the importance of racial, ethnic, and residential identity, in so much as they provide a way for officers to understand and relate to the community that acknowledges the community's way of life, and that understanding, that knowledge structure, and that cultural toolkit, if you will, can shape interactions. And to me, though, that finding really confirms the general takeaway from the RB literature, broadly speaking, right, that highlights shared values, similarities, et cetera. While some of the shared personal identities are clear, there's also conflicts that arise. And so police officers of color may feel duller, for instance, navigating two terrains that often are not compatible due to the historical tensions between communities of color and the police. And while officers of color and officers who are from the community may want to serve their community and respond and represent the community's interests, community members may have certain expectations due to shared identity that can't always be met. And so this is where officers express wanting to avoid preferential treatment, which may be one of the reasons why does not always lead to the benefited outcomes that we hypothesize about in the literature. In trying to avoid bias, officers may try to save face with their peers who might believe that they're showing favoritism or being unfair, and they may want to avoid being stereotyped as someone who kind of favors out the people who look like them. And so more research, I think, in particular, is needed in this area to look at the ways in which where identity conflicts actually occur, why they occur, and what those are to really understand how officers those identity conflicts. And then I think more research is needed to explain the trade-off between what I would call empathetic representation and also this wanting to show fairness or have arm's length treatment. But I think in particular, this finding has implications for how we conceptualize active representation. If bureaucrats are intentionally trying to make their demographics not relevant to or downplay their identity, right? There's implications for how representation as a tool to reduce inequities and yield positive outcomes. And so in light of this, I think interrogating the intersections between RB, representative bureaucracy, and emotional labor or burn, for instance, to reveal potential differences and how bureaucrats navigate that is really another finding from this research is regarding identity formation. And so really highlighting identity as ongoing and flexible and maybe a mutable process as opposed to solely a fixed characteristic or trait. And so this is evident in two ways, for instance. And so one, the fact that officers of color and officers from the community clearly struggled with balancing their work and non-work identities. To me, that suggested that their work identity shapes and reshapes how they see themselves time. And so again, thinking about the way that connects to organizational solution that RB does talk about, but we don't necessarily measure it, right? We never strength of someone's occupational identity and then use that as a control or interaction in a study to see how that makes a difference for their demographic identity and how that plays out. And so I think that can also be something that we look at in future research. And then second here, because there was such a large kind of finding around that personal identity is not kind of it matters about how you understand the community, how you integrate with the community. I wonder whether we should, in the RB literature, start measuring this notion of community identity, particularly for street level bureaucracy that are responding to specific geographic jurisdictions, and seeing whether or not it is a term that's used in community psychology already, but really trying to parse out whether or not a bureaucrat sees themselves as part of the community, irrespective of its demographic group, et cetera, and then how that impacts how they treat the community broadly speaking. And then the last thing that I will emphasize in this screen, which I already at, is the presence and persistence of occupational identity of being a police officer. And so police officers in this study often felt that they were perceived as one by the community and that this was usually for the worst. Interviewees share our stereotypes and stigmas associated with being an officer and wearing the uniform, regardless of how the officer looks or where the officer is from. And to me, I think finding is particularly, again, relevant to what I was saying earlier about actually measuring the strength of an occupational identity. And sometimes I think in the studies, we've tried to get at it through like tenure, like how long have you been an officer, but maybe actually getting people to how they see themselves or not that identity of being an officer, to what extent, like this, how strong it is. And looking at that, I think in quantitative methods could be really important. I think while prior scholarship has suggested that organizational socialization can impede active representation, to me, this study also shows that organizational identity also impedes symbolic representation. Here, obviously, because officers have a visible uniform on, a visible police car, but that in and of itself, when officers are saying that I'm Black, but yet I'm being just perceived as an officer no matter what, right? So the way in which that interacts with symbolic representation is important as well. And thinking about how we can really getting at the strength of any of these identities and identity affiliations is important for moving the research further. One thing that's not on the screen that I think is important before I go into the limitations and wrap it up to acknowledge comes from an observation I had, not from the interview data particularly. But there was these two officers of color that I did ride-alongs with. Talked during the ride-alongs and things like that. Both of them were young Black officers. Both of them were from Hartford, and both of them still lived in Hartford. And their approach to policing was extremely different. One officer was lax with the community, we would drive through certain neighborhoods, he would say, what's up? He knew them by name, they knew him. And he said that he gives them a break sometimes because he gets it, he understands it, da, 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 da. The other officer said, I am so fed up with the crime that's in this city, with the amount of violence that I'm on the community, because I expect better, because I know that you can do better. And so I'm actually harder because I hold the community to a higher expectation. Again, both of these are officers of color, officers from the community, men. And it had me, again, this was from the observational research, and obviously, you know, I won't generalize too much, but it left me with pause thinking about both of them are doing it for similar, both of them think that they're actually have the best interests of the community at mind, but in terms of how they police are actually very different. And so when we say in the research that this outcome we're measuring is indicative of active representation, we're not getting at the actual motivations of people or why they're doing things the way that they're doing. And we can still measure a negative outcome, but again, they thought that they had the community's best interest at mind. And I'm sure if we asked, like, do you think representing the community, they would probably both say yes. And so one of the things that I want to think about, and I'd be welcome to hear if you all have feedback on it, is to what extent this is actually a thing, and it's on these two individual officers that can be measured in future in a more maybe rigorous or systematic way. And so I'll end here with some limitations. And so obviously there are lots of limitations, but there's three in which I would like to discuss. And so one is with regards to how I talk about identity here. And so again, I don't really tease out race and residential identity. I talk about them kind of together with regards to the larger themes, but obviously these are distinct identities and they operate in distinct ways, right? You have to reveal sometimes that you're from the community or you were from the community, whereas race is more of a very visible identity. And so I'm sure that they have different impacts. And so teasing them out, I think, is important. And then also teasing out the racial and ethnic differences. So being Black versus Latinx, again, I talk about them together, but there was huge distinctions in the actual community with like the different cultures of the different neighborhoods, where like how police said that they perceived the Black neighborhood versus how police perceived the Latinx neighborhood and how they perceived those interactions. They felt that the Hispanic avoided police in a different way for different concerns compared to the Black neighborhood. And so I think teasing those differences out could be important. Thinking about generalizability, obviously this is just a single case study, right? The goal of qualitative research is not necessarily generalizability, but thinking about where I want to take this research next, I do think about how the themes and the patterns that I found here could be examined at a broader level. And then with regards to the analysis, again, I didn't go through all of the things that I did to ensure rigor, but I do think two things that I did not do. One is with regards to intercoder reliability. So having someone else actually code the data and then see to the extent we had similar findings. I think that's something that is a limitation of this. And then I did not take an intersectional lens. And so I didn't think about the ways in which women officers of color versus male officers of color may have differences and tease those out. And so I think that could also yield kind of differences with regards to how I analyze the data in particular. And so I will end here. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Andrea. That was a very rich presentation. There's a lot packed in there. So we have plenty of time here for questions. So if we have any questions, Claudia and then Emily.
Andrea, congratulations. It was a fabulous talk and very rich. One question that I have, and I hope that this is going to help all of us who do interviews, is what was the key limitation that you found in doing this research? And second, and this is something that came to mind, I remember that I had a colleague who was an economist in the University of North Carolina, and he used to do studies on policing, and he used to write with police caps. And one of the things that he told me is, Claudia, it's interesting to see how each one uses different strategies to police. They take different routes, they go to different restaurants, small things that actually might matter for the way that they conduct their job. So I wondered if you found also this kind of different strategies, different routes, different patterns that they use.
Yeah, so thank you. The first question with regards to like just the one limitation with doing the interviews in general, I would probably say it's the interview, but thinking about the observations in particular, or it took a long time for people to get comfortable with me. And so like when I think about like when I've analyzed the data, like I was only there for 2 or 3 months. But once spending more time in the police department, once I like baked cookies for them, once like it became clear that like I wasn't there necessarily to just expose all of their negative secrets or what have you. I think people started to open up towards the end, and then they started volunteering to talk to me and things like that. And so I think to me, like overcoming that about how that they may have impacted the first however many interviews I did compared to the latter interviews that came a lot. And so I think that's generally around just thinking how you build rapport when doing this, right? How you are, and I think I benefited from I lived in the Hartford, like I lived in the heart of the city. And I would go there every day. I would attend all the community meetings. Like they saw me everywhere. Like, and I made sure that I think on a more personal level, like doing qualitative research, it was probably the most tiring part of my research experience thus far. Like the amount of energy to be invested there and to like just be talking to so many people every day and things like that, like it really drained me. Sure, towards the end, that probably impacted the way in which maybe I engaged or asked questions. So I think those two, in terms of just like the process of doing the qualitative research, are important to think about. One thing I wrote about, so this was a part of my dissertation when I did my dissertation, and one thing I wrote about when I was being reflective of it is also just the way in which my identity shaped things. And so I had male officers who like would hit on me during the actual recorded interview, and like, that's not okay, right? Or whatever the case may be. So thinking about being a young Black woman doing this research and being in a male dominated organization and how that interplayed, I'm sure that had an impact on things as well. And so I think that's just thinking about the way in which your own identity impacts how people talk and what they're willing to share or not willing to share, for instance. With regards to your second question, during observations, I definitely saw this in the way in which officers would police. And so even how they use their downtime, they would just go to the restaurant and eat during the downtime. And like, they know all the great food spots. And so I enjoyed eating, but other officers were like, no, proactive. And I'm gonna like, I like to go check on these neighborhood organizations or go say hi to these business owners, knew their name and they knew them and things like that. And so thinking about how officers use their downtime was different. I definitely saw differences in how officers actually perceive certain even like street segments where like officers of color, this one Latinx man in particular, like was really had like negative opinions of this one street block in particular. He may have had good reasons for it, I don't know, but like it was very clear in the way in which he interacted with people on that street in particular was very different from how when we policed other parts of the neighborhood he interacted. And so even how geography impacts an individual's own policing strategies themselves as opposed to just across officers was something that was also very clear. And then the last thing I will say is with that, there's always less women on a police force just by the nature of policing, but there was this one incident we responded to, and there was these two women who were there. And so one woman's approach was very aggressive. Like it was a boy who I think ran away from home, but had some mental health issues. And his parents were trying to I forget the proper terminology for it, but essentially like call mental health professionals to like kind of institutionalize him, if you will. And again, I forget the name of it, but he essentially, so the police were dealing with him, but her approach, one woman's approach was so aggressive, like she was cursing at him, she was calling him out of his hurt, and like just really like I had to turn away because like so emotional that like I just, and he was a young boy, I just couldn't take it. And then the other officer, who was a Black woman, ended up saying to her like, can you please just like let me handle it? And she was soft and like approached him, just trying to have a conversation with him and ask him what was wrong. And like all of that happened in the same setting. And so it was also interesting to see the way in which, again, both of these were women officers, but they also handled it very differently. And I would assume that maybe it has to do with like how you perceive a police officer with regards to how your peers perceive you, because other women in their interviews also talked about how men perceive them as like, they're not a good backup. They can't actually, be aggressive enough to hold their own. They're going to get hurt. And so I wonder too, if to what extent that influenced the women who was more aggressive. But again, that's just another example of like the way in which just clearly the same incident, but different approaches, peers are responding very differently in this situation. Yeah. And so hopefully that got out some of your questions.
Thank you, Angie.
Excellent. Emily, I think you were next.
Yeah, I have two. One's pretty logistic. First of all, amazing presentation. I really enjoyed your recent publications. This is really exciting work. I'm curious if you used a certain method or literature to identify community leaders, these like well-connected interviewees, as opposed to people who just interacted with the police once, you know, so I'd be curious to see how you went about maybe network analysis or something to identify those people. And then one is sort of more of an observation, if anything, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. I was sort of surprised to see how much variety there was within one department. In terms of policing like philosophy. I tend to, and I'm not the most familiar with this literature, I'm trying to get more familiar with it, but I would, my kind of assumption is that culture and socialization matter a lot in terms of department by department philosophy of policing communities. And so I was surprised to hear how much variety there was there. And I'd be curious to know if you think with a set of multiple departments, if you would see the impact of certain socialization and certain culture within a policing department, like a highly gendered culture, for example, and how that influences the extent to which identities are allowed to be salient, right, in these police departments.
Yeah, and so great questions. Your first question with regards to community leaders. And so how I identified them was first like just through the news. Like I would just try to Google, and I used all these different search terms to Google like policing in Hartford and try to see like who the community leaders were that were getting quoted a lot in the news. And then I made a list of them. And then also just like organizations that I knew that had like local chapters in most, in most cities. And so like the Urban League, for instance, or the, Boys and Girls Club or whatever, the local NAACP, and so I also knew that like there were certain local chapters. And then once I identified my first like kind of subset of leaders there, and I knew I also want to interview public officials, which were a little bit easier just because you can find all of that information online. Once I identified them, I would email them. Sometimes I would just call. I would show up at events or show up at public meetings and introduce myself and say, this is what I'm doing, this is what I found, etc. And then from that initial sample, I then did snowball sampling and asked them if they had people who made recommendations. I will say though, the community leaders, while I think it was very strategic and intentional that I did that, because I was trying to unpack, like, I want to know what factors are making things better or worse in this community. And one thing that I forgot to mention when I was talking about the selection of Hartford. So Hartford had really problematic statistics, right? So a lot of use of force incidents, police shootings, or just shootings in general, assaults against officers, et cetera. They still were at the top of the list in terms of the police citizen conflict I created. They were up there with Oakland Police Department, Chicago Police Department, the departments you hear about a little bit more. And when I did the news search, I could not find much about them in terms of negative police community relations. Most of the articles for the news search were all positive. And so I really questioned how a department could have these negative statistics, but all of the news articles are pretty positive about them trying to work together and build community relations, et cetera. And so I think that also allowed me to just like be able to identify community leaders in a different way. Your second question with regards to essentially. And so I think there is a literature in police culture that gets at this idea that there is not one monolithic culture. Subcultures do exist within departments as well, but it's not as explored as much, and we don't have as much research like identity. There's theoretical frameworks and conceptual frameworks that talks about the different types of subcultures that could exist, but we don't have as much empirical research that actually occurs and tests to which type of officers may identify more or less with certain subcultures, et cetera, et cetera. I think seeing the variation in this department in particular, it did make me think a lot about the point that you made, that in a culture allows an individual to feel like their identity can be expressed. And so for this department, when I think about the findings around what I called like racial downplaying or avoiding bias and preference that officers of color talked about, in the department, there was a lot of issues internally that officers talked about with regards to how they felt officers of color got promoted, why they felt officers of color was here in the first place. They said it was only because of the Centron consent decree that they lowered standards to let them on the police force. And so there was a lot of tension between the officers of color and the white officers actually that exists more from like an internal perspective. and lots of stories that came out around that. But I think because that was the internal culture, to me, I wonder to what extent that made officers feel like they had to downplay their identity more. Like, I want to just be perceived as professional in a police because colleagues already think I'm here just because I'm Black or because I'm Latinx, or I got to this position because of this, right? And so I do think that culture piece plays a role in terms of how officers enacted their identity, for sure. Did that answer your question?
Excellent. All right. So we've got several hands up. Shannon, and then Jill and Sean.
Hey, yeah, just to add on to the gushing, I love your piece. I know qual work takes a lot, and you can really tell. I really love that you hit on the section of representative bureaucracy that emphasizes the shared values, because I often think we maybe simplify that a bit in RB. As far as the like the identity of being a cop, I'm wondering if there's anything in your interviews that led you to have any beliefs about what they see their identity as a cop, and if there's the conflict between, you know, an authority figure versus like a community servant. And that's all.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. Yeah, and so I think it was brought up a little bit, and so more often than not, when officers, the officer identity is what I call it, they often talked about the way the community perceived them, as opposed to like thinking about the way that they actually perceive their own identity. And that came out a bit more like informally and not in a really systematic way. And I didn't interrogate it enough to like be able to actually make claims about it. But I do think just from like
Oh, you're just like, how do you view yourself? And they're like, whoa.
Right, exactly. Exactly. But I do think that like just from being there and like some of the stories that I heard and things like that, or even the kind of example that I gave about the two officers who shared similar identity, there are differences in kind of how people view what the role of the police even is in the first place, right? And how that plays out. I think the one observation I would say too, though, it was very clear that the officers who were community service officers had a very distinct difference from the officers who were patrol officers. And so that was very clear. They talked about the community very differently. It was almost like I was interviewing like separate departments, if you will, right? And so I think there was a clear distinction there with regards to the unit differences.
Cool, yeah. That's really interesting.
Cool. All right. So Jill and Sean.
Hey, Andrea. For two questions. The first is just to try to use all your hard work to see if we can validate something that we've been trying to do in quantitative work, to understand the difference, the mixed findings regarding symbolic representation using expectancy disconfirmation theory, and the idea that Black citizens may go into interactions with Black officers with higher expectations about treatment, and so therefore they may in fact judge that treatment more harshly based on those expectations. I understand that you were working with police here, but were there things in your interviews that would tend to validate that, or were the police telling you a different story?
Yeah, so I would say probably the expectations came out in the police interviews, maybe particularly around some of the officers who talked about like, oh, they want a handout. That's kind of how they would refer to it. Like they want something more than just like the typical police service, or they want me to be like more lenient or whatever the case may be. And officers were like, that's when they talked about they would want to avoid that preferential treatment. And so community expectations came out for I think in that way. With some officers. I feel like I even have a code called community expectations. Don't quote me on it, but I think I do. I think in the community interviews, though, obviously I didn't talk about them here though, but in the community interviews, it was clear that they wanted officers of color on the police force. It was very clear, but it was also, for some reason in this city, like community members thought it wasn't going to necessarily change behaviors. So they knew that like we want this and we think it's important, but we're not like foolish enough to think that like it's necessarily going to be like the answer to the problems, but we think it makes somewhat of a difference, right? And so thinking kind of about that, but I do think the expectancy point is something really important to think about. And I think it makes a difference for white officers, white students as well, right? When they don't get the treatment that they expect, and then how that impacts their evaluations. And so I would definitely encourage you all to keep doing that. That sounds really fascinating.
Thanks. The second question was about, how do your findings sort of dovetail with Selden's? Is it just if an officer adopts the racial identity rather than putting it at arm's length, that they would tend towards a representative role, or is there some other moderating factor in there that, or ultimately are the two of you talking about very different things?
Yeah, there's a moderating factor in there. I don't know what that moderating factor is yet, or like how to guys it in a really clear way. But I think that there's something else that I don't think it necessarily like wipes away the impact of racial identity. I still think race matters for a variety of reasons or what have you. But I think, to me, the ways in which officers of color spoke about the differences and how they policed and what that meant to them shows that there's something else there that I can't quite grasp yet that makes a difference for whether or not, like, how they police. And maybe it's thinking about the way in which they view the role of their job, broadly speaking, and how that interacts with their racial demographics. Maybe that's it, but I do think that there's something else there, like officer. And so I'm going to interest of these, right? And so in the example that I gave about the two young black officers, one of the differences between the two of them, again, this is just two, but one of the two of them is that one kind of almost like grew up already in the policing kind of view, because he was like in the police athletic league. And then there was like this junior police officer program that like he was also in. He was like the poster child. And so then when he joined the police force, he was also like, look at him from this age to this, like we kind of raised him up all this time. And so maybe the way in which he just views policing as a whole, like the identity longer, as opposed to his racial identity. But I definitely think that there's something there that is different. That said, though, there's a recent study that came out, and I'm sure you all have seen it, in Nature, diversity in Chicago, right? And that to me is probably some of the best work I have seen in thinking about the impacts of diversity in policing. And they looked at race and gender, and found that often officers of color were assigned to parts of the neighborhood that required more aggressive enforcement or crime levels. And so not controlling for that, then you just attribute these differences to race when you can't tease out. But once you control for that, you see these dramatic differences between how officers of color police and white officers. And so I only say that to say that I think race still matters. But I do wonder to the extent that we like miss parts of other things that interact with race to be able to explain some of the variations that we find in the RB literature.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. All right, Sean, you got your hand up.
It's good to see you. I wanted to ask a question about ensuring qualitative rigor. I guess first I want to hear like what was most important to you or salient to you in thinking about that part in the process of your research. And I'm particularly interested to hear about like member checking. So this is sort of top of mind for me because I was talking about this in a class like yesterday on ethnographic methods, and like what was that process like for you, and like reflecting what you were writing and thinking back to the police department?
Yeah, and so I think it's extremely important, obviously, for lots of reasons. I think the most important part, if I'm thinking about qualitative rigor, they're all important. Let me talk about two of them, and then I'll get to member checking in particular. And so I think to the extent that you can actually be in a setting for a prolonged amount of time, I think that makes a huge difference for you being able to just observe things and make sense of the findings in a way that is different if you're kind of a little bit more distant from the field, right? And so that, again, the example that I just gave, for instance, it was me being able to like be on the ride alongs and see them and observe these differences and then wonder like, oh, is that maybe why these interviews are saying this or that, for instance, right? And so I think that prolonged engagement is really important to just giving you that context, the understanding, the fact that like I know so much about the conflicts in the police department, and able to think played out, even though that wasn't central in my interview protocol. I wasn't asking about it HR or whatever, but it came out and I saw it come out in meetings and things. And so that gave me insight to be able to make sense of my findings, I think, in a different way. And so, and I took lots of notes and all of those things. So I think that's important. And that's obviously tied to participant observations as well, but that prolonged engagement is important, I think. Obviously now everything is Zoom. And so I don't think it's like end all be all if you can't, right? Like you just make do with what you can. But thinking about maybe even the limitations if you can, and being really articulate about that. Let's say though, with the actual analysis part, negative case analysis was instrumental to me. And so like I actively looked for things that did not fit into my conceptualizations with regards to what I know about RB, what I know about the things that I should be, like looking for, coding or whatever the case is. Like I actively tried to look for patterns that like, this does not match up with what I would think it did. This does not match up with the theory that I'm trying to assess. This does not match up with, maybe the question or whatever the case is. And like being active in terms of trying to find things that don't fit the theory or the expectations that go against your own beliefs, whether that means it's more critical or less critical, I think is an important part of the process to give you that whole picture, and doing that in a really systematic way. The last thing would be about the member checking point. And so for me, I think member checking occurred in a way that was a little bit more informal. But what I ended up doing, though, is oftentimes when I would have an interview, I would write notes about the interview afterwards, right? And then the next interview that I would do, and again, it wasn't as systematic as maybe it should have been, but the next interview or interviews, or even if I was just doing a ride along, I would bring up points from that prior interview that really stood out, and then try to see like, oh, well, someone else said this, like, what do you think, right? Like, to what extent is this actually a thing that's happening here, right? And so one of the things that a community leader said in you was that the reason he felt there wasn't a lot of like negative media attention or like protest in the city, even though they had a lot of problems, was that the city was just apathetic. Like there's not enough, like there's no one here that really cares enough to do it. It doesn't mean that there's problems, right? It just means that like there's the people are apathetic here, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was something I referred to often again in other interviews, because I was like, okay, like to what extent, like maybe this is a thing, like maybe we didn't think about this, but like really is something to investigate or probe more, right? More often than not, people like shut that down. And I think people shut it down because of course people want credit for like, no, we are doing something right. We don't have a lot of problems. And so maybe when I wasn't able to get at it, but still, I think, again, that's just an example of like taking the things say in the interviews before, things that maybe, are outliers or seem, important that you didn't think about, and strategically bringing them up, even if it means you go off track a little bit, right? I think that is important. That also requires you to be thinking about how you do not necessarily analysis after each interview, but the kind of make sense of the interviews once you're done, and have some time to reflect forward looking to say like, okay, I'm gonna then, probe about this finding a little bit more, ask about that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Awesome.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
I just realized I don't know how to use the reset function. That's on me. And hi, Andrea, Danielle here. Sorry I didn't turn on the camera. The background is just too messy and you wouldn't want to see it. I'm running out of good words to say about your work and your presentation. Just to love it. I am having a question, more like out of curiosity. It is built upon what you said about towards the end, the intersectional lens, and what you mentioned earlier, like women officers react to same situation in very, very different ways. I know this is not the primary interest, the focus of this work, but I noticed there are 9 female officers out of 32 in the interview data, right? Is there any interesting or preliminary patterns along the gender line that you find in the analysis of the interview data? And if the data do not
Yeah, so-
allow you to see the pattern, theoretically, how would you think about the gender difference in female officers' processing of their identities? Female officers of racial majority or minority group, how would they think about all these differently or similarly from their male counterparts? I'm done.
Yeah, and so I think there are clear differences along gender for sure.
Mhm.
Along gender and race, it's a bit harder to then tease out. I think there was only one Black woman who I usually don't, only one Black woman in the department entirely, and so she specifically asked me not to quote her in a paper, for instance, and that has Hartford like, don't say the Black woman because they're going to know who it is. I ended up avoiding an intersectional lens with regards to race and gender overall, because I just wanted to avoid any possibility like someone would be identified, particularly around those like intersections. That said, though, when just looking at gender in particular, there were clear differences with regards to like how women perceived their own role. I did ask explicitly about and whether or not having women on the police force made a difference, and I asked that for all officers. And of course, I think men were like, everyone's the same. I don't know if women do anything different or better or whatever the case may be, but sometimes I think men would say that women were also more talkative or they could de-escalate better. Women, though, when you ask them that question, they talked a lot about the differences and how they perceive themselves engaged community and how the community actually perceived them, similar along lines of de-escalating, using their voice as opposed to using force. And so they did talk about the gender differences and how that makes a difference for what they would perceive as better police outcomes. Like one woman in particular really hammered the point of like how had to like use excessive force ever in any situation. She had been on the police force for like 20 years, right? She said, I just used my words. I think often women, she said that she felt like women give off like a motherly vibe or like, and it disarms people. And so women talked about using their gender as a disarming force, if you will, for the most part. I never interviewed that woman who was like the aggressive one in the example I gave. And so I didn't interview her to see her policing tactics, see how she would articulate how she thought it impacted it. But from the women I did interview, there were definitely clear gender differences. That said, I think there are also, though, it's interesting to not do is like analyze the way in which they felt the community perceived their gender, right, in positive ways, but their peers perceived it in really negative ways. And so they often talked about being in a masculinized environment and how that really impacted them in terms of like being assigned to the juvenile unit, being assigned to the domestic violent unit, and not being considered for promotion opportunities. Those units were not the units that then go up for like sergeant and lieutenant. And so being systematically kind of disadvantaged internally and the ways in which that negatively impacted them kind of from an internal perspective. And so they kind of talked about outward facing, kind of positive, but inward facing, they focused more on the negatives. But there were clear gender differences, I would say.
Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Well, we have a minute or two left if anybody else has a question. If not, let's thank our guest, Andrea. This was a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your research with us. Don't know what your next step is going to be to follow up on this. Maybe you're going to have another extensive case study, or maybe you switch into some other kind of methods. But wish you good luck with your future research, and thanks again for taking the time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming and engaging.
Bye, Andrea.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for organizing this, Erin. Great semester of programming. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thank
you all for attending.
Thank
Do this in person
Thanks,
next time. Yeah.